An interesting day yesterday, and we move on. And this morning, I'm really pleased to introduce our first keynote speaker. He has written over 150 studies, I stopped counting there, and a number of outstanding books in media studies such as Ethics of Media, Media Events in a Global Age, Media Society World, Social Theory of Digital Media Practice, Why Voice Matters, Culture and Politics After Neoliberalism, and the forthcoming Immediate Construction of Reality, which I can't wait to get hold of. He has been invited to speak at most prestigious schools and conferences throughout the world, and as a sociologist of media and culture, he approaches media and communications from the perspective of the symbolic power that has been historically concentrated in media institutions. He's interested in how media and communication institutions and infrastructures contribute to various types of order, social, political, cultural, and so on. His work has drawn on and contributed to social, spatial, democratic, and cultural theory, anthropology, and media and communication ethics. His analysis of media as practice has been widely influential. He's professor of media communications and social theory and department head in the Department of Media and Communications at the renowned London School of Economics. And this remarkable scholar is here with us today to talk to us about the social construction of reality, really. And we're all really delighted that he has accepted our invitation. Dear colleagues, please help me in welcoming Professor Nick Couldry.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, Alexander, for that warm welcome. It's great to be here, and thank you very much, Alexander, for the invite. I'm excited by the topic of the conference. That's why I decided to come. Your title, Communication Between Domination and Emancipation, is a topic that greatly attracts me because it captures very well the path that I've been trying to focus on in my own research for the past 20 years or so. I've always been interested in the paradox that the media spaces, the media structures that most engage us, that most involve us, are also the spaces and structures that are most invested in power. And I've been interested, as I explain shortly, in particular, in how media institutions' claims to power, how that claim to power by media is the most elusive, but also the most broad form of power in contemporary societies. And it requires us to go on thinking about the new forms of that power continuously, forms which sometimes do seem, as you say in the title, ambiguous between domination and emancipation. So this is one of the best invitations I've had for a long time because it speaks to the most important points, the ambiguity of media power. And I imagine that as you look back on the first 15 years of your institute, you're seeking also to review the path that you've traveled, think about where you plan to go next. So in the same spirit, I want to reflect on my own process recently of reviewing and reassessing my research priorities. I've just finished, as you said, a book with Andreas Hepp in Germany called The Mediated Construction of Reality, which comes out this October. And that book is designed to go back to revisit the classic book from the 1960s called The Social Construction of Reality by Berger and Luttmann. It was a classic sociological text from the 1960s, but it doesn't mention media, except it mentions in passing that, well, if we feel like relaxing, we could watch people walking on the moon, something like that. But of course, our real life is here, right here. There's no media here. Well, obviously, that wasn't really completely true in 1966, but the idea that that could be future now is absurd. In fact, we don't just have to think about media, we have to think about digital media, datafied media. And this is what I'm going to come on to, of course. So we have to, in that book, rethink the project of understanding the social construction of reality completely from the point of view of media. And for the first time, I think, in that book, I felt that I'd started to get into balance, into equilibrium, if you like, my interest in social theory and my interest in media theory. So I'm pleased with the book, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today. Because while writing this book, I came to realize that there's a different, an emerging topic that is in fact much larger than the ambition of social theory or media theory, and that I feel now has to be the focus of most of my research in the next few years. I originally planned to say all of my research, but then a certain event happened in Britain yesterday that maybe I will have to think about as well, in terms of its implications. But this event I'm going to talk about, I won't talk any more about that. I'm talking about it all the time. I'm thinking about it. But I'm going to concentrate on what I think will be my main focus for the next few years, and this is the corporate attempt to construct social reality itself. Really. And as I'll explain, this theme is going to be the beginning of a new book to be written with a Mexican scholar now living in America called Ulysses Mejias, that we've just started, and we're proposing at the moment to call it The Costs of Connection. I have a research project in London called The Price of Connection. So I'm going to come back to that later on. But first of all, before I get to that, I want to put it in the broader context of the approach to power that I've taken throughout my work, because that may not be familiar to all of you, and I want to give you the context. So I start off with my long-term interest, which, as Alexander has said, is always in the social consequences of the way I see media, their essential feature, which is the concentration of symbolic power in media institutions. I'm not really interested as such in film or television programs, journalism, as texts. Other people are, that's fine. But I'm interested in the concentration of power in media institutions. And particularly one type of power, which is the power to represent the social world back to social actors. To play our lives back to us in a different form and say, this is your reality. Now this, some people have theorized symbolic power in a weaker way as just the power to do things through symbols. And that's important, that's where this starts. But I'm interested in what happens when that sort of power builds and builds over time, particularly in certain institutions, so that it becomes something very different. It becomes what Pierre Bourdieu called a strong form of power, symbolic power, the power of constructing reality. That's the type of symbolic power that I'm interested in. And that sort of power is sustained by a certain way of organizing things. I don't believe in the old Marxist theory of ideology, that everyone sees the world upside down. They can see it, but it's upside down, so if they just turn it around, they can see the way things really are. Because that believes that ideology is just about believing the wrong things. But I think it's more than that. I think ideology is about organizing things in the wrong way, doing the wrong things. And this is what I call, in some of my work, the myth of the mediated center. I'll come back to explain that a little bit later on. But in shorthand, what I mean by myth of the mediated center is the whole way of arranging things in our societies, which, if you like, installs something like a social centre as a centre of value, a centre of how we explain what goes on for us, and installs the media in particular as the privileged pathway or gateway to accessing that centre. That's the basic principle that's gone through all my work for 20 years, that this idea that our societies are media societies is not untrue. It is, in a sense, true, but it's a truth we construct all the time. We have to make it happen. In particular, media institutions have to make it happen. That's what they do every day. If they didn't, they wouldn't exist, or they wouldn't have our belief. We would just turn our backs. We wouldn't be listening. We wouldn't be watching. If we were not constructing that truth that our society is organised around media. It could all be organised in a different way. And that myth of the mediated centre, but as I'll come to later, this is not the only myth we need to think about, is made real, made alive by various things which I call media rituals, such as reality media, which are a sort of social form. I'm not interested in reality media as a text. Maybe someone else can read them, but I'm interested in it as a social form. It's something we do. Real people go into real studios and expose the secrets of their lives for real in front of other people and suffer the damage, the costs of that. That's a social form. It's much more than a text. And it's a form that embeds certain norms, ways of doing things right, ways of doing things wrong. And it builds on certain category distinctions, as the anthropologists have been telling us for a century, are very important to how we understand reality. Distinctions, for example, between the celebrity and the so-called ordinary person. That's the rest of us. As if there was really a difference. We know there's no real difference except in a few cases of people with exceptional talent. But it's not because they have exceptional talent that they're celebrities, it's because they're marked by the media as media people, as opposed to the rest of us who are not media people. Now, this type of work that I spent my first 10 years of my career really thinking about, I think is still relevant. It's still relevant to and important to deconstruct the sorts of forms of social discrimination that go on through media. But let's face it, even though we're media scholars, we can be honest to each other that this is a specialist topic. It's one you care about, particularly if you care about media, as we do. But there are also other forms of power, other forms of inequality, which are very, very important, and some people care more about them than they care about media. And for most researchers, those other things are much more important than media that we're concerned with. We have to be realistic. But what I want to argue today is that provided we understand media in a very broad sense, there's a new form of research agenda emerging now, which is actually not just of importance to us as media scholars, it's actually at the core of research for everyone in the humanities and the social sciences. In fact, it affects all citizens, whether they're academics or not. And this is the topic to which I think I need to be orienting my work in the next 10, 15 years, and this is the topic I want to talk to you about today. Because this is a topic that puts our concerns as media researchers right at the center of the humanities and the social sciences. So the issue today of thinking about media's role in the social construction of reality really goes much wider than it did until even 5 years ago. First thing we have to think about, of course, as you're very well aware of here, I know social media is extremely active, and I've been reading about this in Banja Luka. Obviously, we think about the rise of social media platforms as alternative places where we focus our attention, maybe in a sense alternative centres of something, of society. Maybe these can be seen as alternatives to mass media. That's a complicated question. Actually, I think it's a different situation. I think it's more a matter of the increasing interdependence of mainstream media and social media, what I call in one of my books a sort of double helix, as in the genetic code. With the two linked together, you can't separate them anymore. Social media, that's us, and mass media, that's them or us in the form of media. The two are intimate. They feed off each other. And of course, there's an increasing push across the wider corporate sector to represent this new space of social media platforms as the space where the social is now happening. That's what the British people are thinking. That's what they're tweeting now. They're happy, they're in despair. And here I think we see emerging a different type of myth. You realise I like the word myth. I'm going to explain why in a minute. The myth of us. Before I explain what the myth of us is, I want to tell you why I use the word myth, which I think is relevant to you in this part of the world, because, as I said, I don't mean by myth or ideology simply, as Marx did, an explicit form of belief, a credo. I believe in the dictatorship of the proletariat or the ruling of the financial elites or whatever. It's not that sort of thing. Rather, following Slavoj Žižek, I prefer to see myth, like ideology, as a way of doing things, as an arrangement of practice that holds in place somehow a certain way of doing things, and it holds it in place even if we don't believe in it. Even if we don't believe in celebrity, if, I don't know, Tom Cruise or whoever turns Schwarzenegger, whoever it might be, whoever is your favourite celebrity, Justin Bieber, whatever, comes through the door right now, I guarantee all of us, myself included, would interrupt the lecture, interrupt the whole social forum now and look. Oh. Now that is a thing we do, and it's enough that we do it according to Slavoj Žižek. That already is the ideology. It doesn't matter when we think, oh, stupid, oh, come on, it's not really, it's only a celebrity, I don't really believe in celebrity. It doesn't matter, you still turn your head, you still gasped. That's ideology, according to Slavoj Žižek. And to be honest with you, is when I read that passage in Žižek's Sublime Act of Object of Ideology, 20 years ago, 19 years ago, that was a turning point for me. Because that's when I realized we could go on thinking about ideology, even though who knows what people believe. It's too complicated. But what they do, we can study that. It's a fundamental insight that Žižek had. Now that's not to say, of course, that at the same time there aren't lots of beliefs, ideological attempts to control belief, which are out there. Of course there are. And in fact, it's interesting, if you hold on to that traditional notion of belief and ideology and myth, to look at this example from the director of the MIT Media Lab, who actually said that the ideology, the internet, is not a technology, it's a belief system. Which is interesting for a technologist to say that. The internet is a belief system. That's not the official line, but I think it's correct. It's a belief system. It's a way we organise things and believe it's right to organise things, or believe other people tell us we should be organising things. So this takes me on to what I call the myth of us, which is not just an explicit belief system, we may or may not believe, but it's a way of organising things around the assumption that the place where we are on social media is somehow the place where we naturally come together. That's us, whoever us are, the people who we care about. And as a result of that, instead of the old ideological product of the mass media age, which was, as David Morley, who was my PhD supervisor, put it, the nation now is happy, sad, angry, etc. We now have, instead of that, as the Media Guardian put it in September 2013, us. They said that in 2013, the number one media influence was you, the people reading the newspaper, which is very flattering and nice to be told we're important. As you know, Time magazine had the same thing. They said Media Personality of the Year in 2013 was us. And that, I believe, is a mythical process, this idea of telling us that we are the centre of power. And that myth is reflected also in academic writing, some writing anyway. There are some people, such as Rainey and Wellman, who write that through social media platforms we have a complete re-engineering of the social world. They talk about the rise of a different social order, as they call it, using computer language, a networked social operating system that gives people new ways to solve problems, to meet social needs. They say that the new media is the new neighborhood. Well, I'm aware that in Banja Luka, and this is a really interesting thing maybe we can talk about, there's a law specifically punishing people for bad comments on social media. And that's a serious debate, because real harm can be done through social media. There's no doubt about that. Now, but you can have that law without buying into this idea that the new neighborhood, the only neighborhood, is the neighborhood we have on media. Presumably the reason behind the law here in Banja Luka was that people's lives, the situations, their real neighborhoods could be damaged by what people were saying on the neighborhood of social media. So it doesn't necessarily imply a theoretical position, the law. But these people do have a theoretical position, which is that the new media simply is the new neighborhood. And this way, I think, ideological way of thinking about what social media platforms are relates, of course, to the fundamental economics of social media platforms. Let me just say a little bit about this. It's very clear, as we all know, that in economic terms, the business models of social media platforms are based not on selling services, because most of the platforms offer free services, but instead on the selling of data. Or rather, the generating of highly targeted advertising revenue that is based on that underlying data. So it's not surprising, of course, that we see traces of this myth of us in the way industry talks. In fact, it's maybe not surprising, if this myth of us is so essential to the business models of social media platforms, that the people representing those businesses sometimes sound like social theorists these days. Here is Mark Zuckerberg, quoted by Jozef Van Dyke, saying that Facebook, this was when he was floating Facebook in 2012 on the US Stock Exchange, he actually said, like a social theorist, Facebook is a fabric that can make any experience online social. He's more social theorist than I am. Or you can say, Sheryl Sandberg, the Deputy Chief Executive of Facebook, said you can't be on Facebook without really being your authentic self. Because you must have a theory of the authentic self, which is pretty robust, so you can say that. That's social theory as business, which is an interesting new form we see these days. So I could go on like this for hours, just deconstructing what I read as an ideological view of social media by business leaders. But the serious question I want to ask you today is it enough to endlessly deconstruct the myth of us and the other myth and how it works? And my key argument to you is that he's not enough to do that. Of course, it's important for us as intellectuals to go on deconstructing myths, but it's not sufficient. And the reason for that is that this myth is a lot more than myths we've tried to deconstruct in the past. Myths which, for example, involve just a sort of rhetorical cover, a nice story that's told to sell us a business strategy. If that was all it was, then it's good to deconstruct it, because then maybe we don't believe in the business strategy and we go to another product or we do something different. If that were the case, then deconstruction will be good, it will be enough. But if we go back to the point that myth is not just about what we believe, but it's about what we do, the way the world is organized, then it's not enough just to deconstruct our beliefs. And what is involved, I think, linked to this myth of us is not just a language that tries to cover up a business strategy. That's rhetoric, that's normal. There's nothing very disturbing about that. Of course, people tell you a different story while trying to do something else. That's normal, we all do that. Business does it on a very large scale. But we're looking at today something rather different, which is a much deeper, a much broader project, which literally is trying to reconfigure all social relations around a completely new model, which is fully marketized. So in thinking about the myth of us, this is simply the starting point for opening up the bigger topic, which is the topic I want to talk about. Because the myth of us is just the imaginative cover for something much bigger, which is an attempt literally to reconstruct the social world, social experience, the possibilities for social life, to rebuild it for a certain purpose, which is so that all those spaces of social experience can be spaces for the automatic generation of economic value. And economic value being generated, of course, through the gathering of data, through the aggregation of data, and of course, for the direct or indirect reuse of that aggregated data for profit. Now again, you might say, well, come on, is capitalism is still going on, what's the big deal? Yeah, sure. The aim to increase opportunities for profit from everyday life somehow is not new. I'm not saying it's new. What is new, and what should be our topic, and this is the truly astonishing thing, is the scale, the breadth of this ambition. That's what I want to bring home to you. We'll come back in a moment to how we could think about this, but first we have to mention the complex background to this, because I'm not saying for one moment that here there's a big conspiracy going on by evil business owners trying to take power from us. I'm not saying that. There's a very serious thing that's driving this ambition to rebuild social life for profit by social media platforms, and that is a profound crisis, an economic crisis in America and many other places. In the earlier model of advertising, which I'm sure you learn about here, advertising was based around mass media, where you could reach your target audience through putting an ad in a football match or a popular TV program, whatever, and you knew the people, whoever they are, were somehow there, and sometimes you could know precisely what type of people were there. You didn't know how much difference it would make, but there was a good chance it made some difference. Now, advertisers are no longer confident. They know where people are, or whether they've switched off the advertising via their television system. So they have to find other ways to reach them. As Joseph Thoreau explains in his brilliant book that we were discussing last night, his book, The Daily You, which is strongly recommended. It's one of the most depressing books you could read, but it's also good to read the heart of the advertising industry and the crisis in that industry and how they tried to solve that crisis than Joe Turreau. He explains, for example, the history of the cookie, how it started, how it became this massive thing that dominates all our lives. So it's not just, of course, the crisis in the advertising industry and the attempt to solve it, but also around that for the past 15 years, the vast expansion of whole industries for tracking us, for keeping us under surveillance, integrating that into the basic language, the basic thing that advertisers now do. And of course, there's a cost here for content producers, and this is what Joe Turreau is particularly worried about. If you are, the editor of The Guardian or The Times newspaper or Le Monde or whatever, El País, whatever newspaper you like internationally, you can't get so much advertising revenue now by just putting the ad in the newspaper, because people know not many people buy the hard copy newspaper. And if they're online, they certainly don't want to look at the ads. So how are you going to get advertising revenue? Well, one way people these new editors are now increasingly doing that is by having deals with advertisers or with data miners who link to the advertisers. And they're beginning, this is just a beginning of a trend that Joe thinks will become dominant, and it's an interesting possibility. That increasingly we will receive news on our phones, particularly our phones, which will be targeted, especially for us, the sort of spin on that story that we will want, trying to show that it makes a difference if the story is told this way or that, because that's interesting data for advertisers next time. So what was a public service to offer knowledge about society becomes a tool just to sell us stuff better at a time when it's becoming very hard to sell us anything. These are really serious economic pressures in the advertising industry, and since I'm not advocating the end of market societies, advertising is going to remain very important. So this is a crisis in the nature of capitalist economies. And the solution, and this is the key point, is this world of tracking and surveillance. So we see, of course, the rise of social media, all the media forms that surround them, the apps, and so on. They're much more than specific media texts that we might read. You can read them, they're interesting to read. They're much more than that. I see them as part of a wider transformation of social relations. That's the only way to really understand what's going on here. These are not texts. These are changes in the way we live our lives, the way we live our lives in relation to institutions. The key insight is in a wonderful article from 2010 by Carlton Gillespie, where he thinks about the idea of platform. It seems an ordinary descriptive term, we use it that way, but actually it's a much deeper concept. It is the word that somehow became necessary to give a name to a profound change in social relations, whereby things have been arranged so that when we go onto Facebook, where somehow our social life, our friends, our most personal things, the fabric of our social life is directly right there in interface with commercial interests for selling things to us. That's what a platform is. It's this natural, apparently natural, of course, it's not natural at all. It had to be discovered, built, sold, interface between social processes and commercial processes where they can interact without anything getting in the way. And that leads to the possibility of imagining a new type of economic organization in which the whole of social life, not just what we do on this or that platform, but everything we do anywhere, at any time might be translatable, might be transposable into marketized forms. That wasn't imaginable before social media platforms. Now it is what's driving the imagination that's driving all businesses. Now, how do we think about this? Well, I've been worrying about this from the beginning of the year as I start this new book with Ulysses Machias. And apologies to say this, but I think that Marx has something useful to say about this, as does Karl Polanyi, who wrote a book in World War II about the birth of capitalism. They both make a fundamental point, which is that markets are never natural. Selling things might be in a sense natural, but the structures that enable me to sell something to someone on the other side of the country, the other side of the world, that has to be constructed. We have to create the social conditions under which this can get to bear for a determined price on the terms we agree and so on and so forth, and you pay me back. This has to be socially constructed. Both of them emphasize that the social constructions under which large markets are possible have to be created. There has to be a social transformation. And there was in the early 19th century, and it was immensely violent and painful. And I think what we're seeing therefore today is not the production of the social conditions for yet more markets. We already have markets. What's being produced is something different, which is the social conditions for the marketization of everything into what I call, in my book we just finished, a managed continuity. The goal is to manage everything we're doing, everything you're doing right now with your phones, everything you might be thinking, later in the day you might do with your friends, into a plane, a possibility, which can be converted into value for markets. Now that's bad enough, that's a big ambition that we need to think seriously because it has power implications we'll come back to. But there's one other thing we need to keep in mind, which is that the basis of this is not just social engineering, it is our agreeing to continuous automated surveillance of everything we do, of the surveillance of our once private life. That's the condition without which nothing else of this can happen. And what's interesting is that this condition, this precondition, until recently was something considered completely incompatible, not just with a good political order, with democracy, maybe that's too ambitious, but it was considered incompatible with a good human life at all. Consider that wonderful film about East Germany, in the Soviet era, The Lives of Others. I don't know if you remember this beautiful film. Now, I think it's important to remember that we never liked mass surveillance in its earlier forms. And in a sense, it's much easier for me to talk about this from Britain, where we haven't had such a strong tradition of mass surveillance until recently than you've experienced in any way that had Soviet control. It's a more painful topic for you. But we've never liked this in the past. We didn't like the witch trials in the 17th century, the Spanish Inquisition, the surveillance states of 20th century Russia, East Germany, and so on. And when we watch a film about former East Germany, such as The Lives of Others, my feeling was that we sense this compassion for the lead character, there he is with the headphones on, this lonely surveillance operative, condemned to a life of watching the lives of others that we know is a bad life. We know that's not how a human being should live. That's why we feel compassion for him. We know he's doing something bad. So my question to you is, how can a whole infrastructure of surveillance that in another context was so obviously wrong, indeed immoral, suddenly become right? In fact, celebrated. when it's performed by other actors, for example, start-up companies on the American West Coast. Friendly people wearing grey t-shirts, jeans and trainers. How come their surveillance is suddenly okay? What's happened? Have we changed our minds? No. Have we changed what we're doing? Yes. This is a serious question. So the question is, how do we respond to this? And this is the thing that I want to go through. This basically, I'm saying to you, this is now the topic of media studies. This is the topic of communication studies, information science, data science. This is the joint topic that we all face. We are tremendously well positioned as media scholars who understand power and symbolic power to be saying this is the topic. You can't afford not to be listening to what we are talking about. But at the same time, we have to meet the challenge that this topic is so vast. This is a corporate ambition that has never had any precedent in history. It has never been possible for corporations to have such a big ambition. There has never been the infrastructure that's made that possible. Now it is possible, so the ambition is possible. And that is the size of our topic. It's a terrifying topic. So how do we think about it? Well, let me just run through some possibilities. It's obvious that I don't have the answers here. We were talking about this last night. Well, what do we do as citizens? We'll come back to it in Q&A. It's a really interesting question. But let me just run through some possibilities. First thing I think we have to do as analysts of the social world, as analysts of media, we have to avoid making what I call the inscription fallacy. That was from the piece I wrote about Myth of Us 2 years ago, which is basically reading the world out there as academics, as if it really is the way that we naturally want to read it to be. I mean, we're trained to read things. We read the world as if it was a book to be read, and we could read off the results, and there we are. It's very dangerous to think the world actually is that way. That we have to assume it is so that we can read it. It's therefore very important, I think, to take the arrangement of things today, particularly the arrangement we're told is natural and normal, social media platforms, all these social spatial arrangements, to read them, but read them in a different way, to understand them as corporate projects, attempts to transform reality so that it can be a certain way for a certain benefit, which is the managed continuity of markets which enable continuous generation of profit. And that's not to deny that what we do on social media is real. Of course it's real, but it's something that's emerged following a certain corporate project that we have been involved in helping become a reality, of course. It's not imposed upon us, literally. We are part of it too. We're part of that corporate project. So that's the first thing. Analytically, we need to get a certain distance, which is to understand the corporate intention that is involved in what seems so natural to us. Second thing is, sociologically, we have to grasp the attempt of new media institutions, such as Facebook, to literally do something very specific in sociological terms, which is, as Ulysses Mejias said in his book Off the Network from 2013, great book, I recommend it. He says that we have to start thinking about social media platforms as not bad or evil, but literally the result of a corporate attempt to appropriate the spaces and the forms of the social, to make them theirs, to appropriate. Doing it through the notion of the platform. Now the key point there again is that if that happens, other social worlds, which are not on the platforms, which are not configured the right way to be easily represented on the platforms, get excluded, get forgotten. So we have to think about the costs of this as well. The third way of responding is ethically. which is I think we have to think seriously about the costs for freedom, for everyday human freedoms, of this increasing dependence of all of us. I've been on Twitter, Facebook this morning, as I'm sure you have, and so on. Our dependence, increasingly, not on other people, not on light, the basic infrastructures, but on systems for information transfer and systems of surveillance that underlie those infrastructures. A very interesting figure is the legal theorist Julie Cohen, who recommended her book called Configuring the Network Self from 2012. And I just want to stress something why that book really shocked me again. She's a legal theorist working in Washington, D.C., trying to convince policymakers this needs to change, you need to change this law. So she doesn't use words, casually. She's really controlled in what she says. She knows when she uses the word, she knows why she's using it. Well, when a legal theorist like that says, I think we are moving to an authoritarian social order, that makes me notice. And why does she think this order based around social media's platforms, IT systems, they're embedded in our lives as authoritarian? For the very simple reason, not that there are literally fascists telling us what to do at the top, of course there are, but because the terms of our dealings with the system are not negotiable. We have no choice but to accept them, most of the time. If you don't accept them, then your password doesn't work. You're out. Your problem. That, she argues, is de facto authoritarian. So if it is, we should name it that way. Not pretend it's something else. Not pretend it's about freedom of opportunity, freedom of self-expression. Anyway, that's when a legal theorist says that, I think it's worth at least pausing and think maybe she's right. Then politically, what do? Well, we have to register all these developments as a challenge to the normal boundaries around the political. Yes, and this is why I think we need to continue to think about emancipation. Of course, these ways of being together and acting together open up new possibilities, new political spaces. I don't deny that for a moment. But the other side of that is that they also open up a new type of power, which is power over the spaces of politics. Imagine if, throughout history, every single town square in every city in the world not only was watched by the police continuously with an unlimited archive of footage, but all those databases interlinked forever and could be consulted at any time to see what you were doing in 2012 in the town square of Banja Luka or Barcelona or Madrid. Would that be okay? That is the world in which we're entering. It's not okay, in my view, because that is a power over the possibility of being political that we are now accepting as totally normal, totally fine. Let's pursue those ideas just in a bit more detail, and we started a bit late, didn't we, Alexander? So I'm assuming we're adding on the time. So. A bit more detail. Ulysses Mekias talks in his book, as I said, about what gets left out of this. He asks a really important question in his book. What does the digital network include in the process of forming its assemblage? And more important, what does it leave out? The sorts of things, thoughts, ideas that you think, no, I won't put that on Facebook or whatever because no one will like it. No one's interested in it. What happens if we do that for years and years and years? Maybe we stop having those thoughts. We learn not to have those thoughts. What's the consequence of that? That's the first thing we need to think about. Second is Julie Cohen in her book that I mentioned. She tries to build a way of thinking about this, how to resist it, And she calls it a cultural environmentalism, which is again an interesting phrase for a legal theorist. She has read her cultural studies, which makes her very unusual amongst legal theorists. And she again wants to get away from the idea of seeing the deal we have with social network systems as simply what is dictated by market logic, so therefore we have to accept it. Instead, she wants to think about it as a culture, a way of living together that's different, that we need to understand as a culture, and if we don't like it, maybe resist as a culture. It's a culture. So when you think about the environment that that culture creates for us, and we also have to think, as she says, about the gap that's now opened up between the rhetoric of liberty through Facebook and every other platform, and the reality of diminished individual control. Because we can't control our relations with systems. If our password doesn't work, it doesn't work. We can't renegotiate the terms on which passwords work. We have to get another password. Or do something else. As she says, the configuration of network space also is increasingly opaque to its users, i.e. we can't see into it. We don't understand it, most of us, almost all of us. We don't understand fully how it works. In fact, we know we can't. Again, in political terms, that used to be a problem with political systems, not being able to understand how that decision was taken. Somehow, we're encouraged to accept it in relation to IT systems. And there's a phrase. The system operates by a system of governance that is authoritarian, because we have no right to be consulted about it. So we need, in response, she argues, to build values which are based on how we actually live with information, the difference it actually makes to our lives, which may be positive in some cases, and how that shapes our possibilities for becoming people, for growing up, for learning at school, for being with our families, doing all the other things in our life. How do we think about that cultural consequence? And underlying all of this, and the most general relevance, I think, to the theme of the conference, there's a political challenge which is involved in doing this sort of academic work. First of all, we mustn't turn our backs on these new spaces of appearances, to use Hannah Arendt's great phrase. I'm not saying for one moment that you leave Facebook, Twitter. Of course I'm not saying that. That will be arrogant anyway, but I'm not saying that. I'm not going to do that. I'm not suggesting that. We can't literally go off the network. There are positive things about being on the network with people we love or people we like, people we don't yet know, but we discover something from that is positive and important. The point is not to go off the network, but to hold on to other visions, other versions of the social that aren't fully shaped by networks. To see social media networks and the system in which they're embedded as a very explicit corporate attempt to construct a certain type of social life until it becomes natural. To see it for what it is and to decide whether we're happy with that or not. And if not, to think about what we do next. And that means also grasping the potential injustice that now builds from what we're doing, which is concentrating the power to construct the social, to construct the real, in a very narrow set of institutions. You all know how few people, institutions such as Facebook and Google, Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp, employ, compared with their market value. This is a complete redefinition of how economic power relates to numbers of employees, size of the institution. It's a radically different type of corporate institution. But in any event, the power that is concentrated in that small set of institutions, mainly on the US West Coast, is unprecedented in history, in terms at least of symbolic power for constructing a social reality. I'm a particular fan of a novel. I don't know if anyone heard of Dave Eggers' novel, The Circle. I don't know if it's come here in translation or whatever. Came out, he lives in San Francisco. The novel came out in 2013, just like with incredible luck in terms of marketing. It came out just 2 months after the Snowden revelations, which is perfect for the marketing, because this novel is a fable of power. It's called The Circle because it's about a corporation, which is a sort of hybrid of Facebook and Google, that's very clear, that has a very simple ambition, which is to complete the circle, to complete the informational circle, whereby everything in everyone's lives, and every possible interconnection between anything in anyone's lives, is there in the circle, controlled by one corporation, accessible by one password only for everything anyone does, which is so convenient, so that that corporation can control it, totalize it. It's an interesting story about the corporate ambition, but it's also a terrifying story about an injustice being done in the same way, which affects the characters in the novel as they start to get very worried by this. And I call it there a loss of the possibility of challenging what's going on here, because the people who work for the corporation are absolutely forbidden to challenge the principles of the circle. They have to be loyal to it. They're members of the corporation. They have to give everything in their lives, all personal data, to the circle. And they, in the end, have a crisis. It's very difficult to do. But we are facing a sort of what Nancy Fraser, the political theorist, calls a meta-political injustice, which is not the normal political injustice about taxes, public services direct, that's important, but it's an injustice about the terms on which some people are allowed to vote, become citizens, and count, and others don't. The migrant population is the most obvious form of this debate right now in Europe. There's a meta-political injustice. But this here, in David's novel, is also a meta-political injustice because you're offered a vision of social reality in which corporations control what happens to the flow of information, and it's given that you can do nothing about that. That's the terms of the deal. And that, of course, is the deal that's built into projects such as the Internet of Things, where every object will be linked up in the future as well. It's the deal line, the increasing datafication of health, products, particularly in the United States, but it's spreading across the world, driven by insurers, that in order to get health benefits, we will be required to submit, particularly if we're not well, to continuous monitoring of our bodies. So this is an important project to think about the injustice that may be being done here. And putting it another way, if, this is what I'm really saying, coming to the conclusion, if we now live in a world where social ontology, not just media ontology, social ontology, what there can be in the social world, is now the project of business, is what businesses are trying to change at the largest scale, at the largest possible scale, then for us as academics it becomes a very urgent project to try and track these processes of constructing social reality. We can't say, okay, well, just go and study this or that platform and enjoy it, and it's interesting data for me, I can do something with it. No, we need to think about the bigger project, which is the construction of reality through things like platforms. That's, of course, assuming that as academics we are interested not just in doing sociology critically, because, of course, as I've been implying, it's not enough to just think, well, I can sit in my study and read books, and I can criticize those naive people out there who are on Facebook and are silly. That's the sort of view of sociology of critique which they attack. It says, well, somehow the sociologist is up on the stage looking down on everyday reality and said, no, 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 don't do it that way. That's wrong. You have false consciousness. That's not good enough. In a plural world where it is very confused, these developments are happening for very strong reasons. They're not happening through a conspiracy. They're happening because business is facing profound problems. It's trying to find solutions, but the solutions happen to be the loss of our freedom. And it's often trying to sell that to us. So we have to be involved in that world. We have to be committed to understanding the conditions under which, given these starting points, critique now becomes possible. And that you can't start critique by saying that social platforms will go away. They're not important. That's absurd. We have to start from there and think, well, how do we think about what critique now looks like? In other words, getting this social ontology right, thinking about what is going on and the projects to change social ontology is the core topic, I think, for a genuine sociology of critique, as Luc Boltanski from Paris argues in his book On Critique, which is another really interesting book. It doesn't mention media. In fact, most social theorists don't talk about media, but everything he says fits very well with media. You just read it. It fits beautifully with what I've been saying. And he says in that book that reality tends to coincide with what appears to hang together. What appears to hang together becomes reality. Because what appears to hang together over time is order. It's what works. What works becomes reality. So the project to change what works, what hangs together, is the project to construct reality. And today, as Dave Eggers warns us, there's countless empirical projects, and we're going to hear from Thomas soon, a very, very interesting empirical project, countless forms of everyday citizenship, countless things we argue about in little places. Once we link them together, what's emerging is, as I'm saying to you today, a project to change what counts as social order, to change the way that things and practices hang together, and as a result, to change in a fundamental and lasting way the construction of reality. Not just our imaginings of reality, but the basic forms of order. Which means, as I've already hinted, that we have a theoretical job to do we may talk about. We need some big theorists to help us out with this. This is a big problem. So, we do need to go back to older resources for analysing domination. Marx's theory of capitalism, in whatever respects it was incorrect, it was a form of thinking about the economy as a set of social relations. So if we're living through a time when our social relations are fundamentally being changed to build a different economy, then maybe there's something in Marx, just something we could think about it. I know a Marxist, but I'm interested in going back to Marx now to see is there something there that might give us something to hold on to as we think about these profound changes. But also, this is what I'm working with Ulysses, to also think about post-colonial theory. Because it's obvious that all of this is happening on a global scale. Social media platforms are being marketed on a global scale. And therefore, and yet they're being marketed from some very specific places on the planet, principally the US West Coast or certain parts of China. There's a massive battle between the Chinese platforms and the US West Coast platforms at the moment. But it's maybe not too strange to see these as new types of colonial projects. Because remember, as we learned for a long time, colonial projects involve not just economic domination, but the domination of knowledge. Control over the flow of knowledge, claiming this is the story of the world, through which you must understand your domination. Well, and we want to suggest that both Marxist and post-colonial theory, in some form, may be useful tools now for thinking about how we begin to resist all of this. But at the same time, and this is where I want to end, and this goes back to your wonderful title of the conference, we've also got to recognize that not only have the starting points for power changed, but the starting points for emancipation, for freedom, have also changed. And this was, of course, always Marx's point, that what capitalism builds, of course, he proved wrong in some of his predictions, but his point was that we have to, if we are not to give up the ghost, we have to think seriously about how the very same conditions that are the conditions of power we must analyze and deconstruct and criticize are also the conditions of possibility of a different type of emancipation. So that's why I think the title of this project, Between Domination and Emancipation, focuses on the essential issue of our age. That's why I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.